Well, I was slightly surprised, but I shouldn't have been earlier this week when Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition, went after Gary Anandasangri, that's the public safety minister, for a solid 10 minutes straight in question period. It was so bad that Ananda Sangari started repeating his scripted answers again and again till he was finally saved by an intervention of the slightly but not much smarter justice minister. The reason that Ananda Sangari was on his feet was that he was recorded talking to a tenant. You see, Ananda Sangari isn't just an MP. He's not just the minister in charge of public safety. That's a huge portfolio. Everything from border to spies to terrorist groups, like it's to prisons. It's a huge job, but apparently, like half the Liberal cabinet, he's an entrepreneur. By which I mean he owns a bunch of residential properties and he goes around collecting rents. That's one of the reasons why the Liberals obviously love high housing prices. So I would feel pretty busy if I was the public safety minister, but apparently Gary has higher priorities. So he was talking with a tenant, and for 20 minutes, this tenant, who was obviously a law-abiding gun owner, was by the way, this was brought up by Gary Anandasangri. It was not brought up by the tenant. Recording Gary, I'm just going to say Gary because his last name's hard to say, saying, look, this gun buyback is just for show. It's stupid policy. Don't worry about it. If you get in trouble, you're a buddy of mine, so I'll make sure your bail is covered. Like, it was just crazy. And good on his tenant for recording him. Here's just a couple of minutes of that to remind you how crazy it was.
These guys, I hate to say it with catch and release policies, these guys are caught, right? Might spend a couple of days in jail, get a bail hearing, and out they go.
Yeah.
But you're taking stuff away from people that aren't the problem.
Yeah. Listen, it's voluntary. Okay, that's the only thing.
It's not voluntary.
Yeah.
So what's the third option? So I deactivate, I turn them in. What's the third option?
Third option is you don't do either.
And? What's that mean?
Then it's up to the local police.
So then what's that mean to become?
Yeah.
What's that? A criminal?
If police enforce it, yes.
Well, of course the police are going to enforce it. Because you're going to mandate.
Well, it's already in the criminal, it's there.
It's already written in the criminal code.
Yeah.
So you're saying is if I don't deactivate or return them at a loss,
Yeah.
I'm going to be a criminal.
In your case, whatever your losses, you tell me, I'll personally.
It's not the point.
I'll
What
offset.
do you think may have done better? I mean, it's being rolled out anyways.
Look, I'll tell you, if I were to redo this from the beginning, like I'm picking up where it was left off, right? And
But you have the power to roll back.
But this is the mandate I was given by Carney to complete this.
Because you guys look like fools rolling, like stepping back.
And not revisit this.
Sure.
That's my objective, right? Just to put an end to this and move on with other additional criminal justice tools, including on bail, including on increasing penalties for people who have illegal and unlicensed firearms. So a range of things that we're already going to be doing.
But this is not new. This has been happening for over a decade.
I'll tell you, the going forward, it'll be a different approach. Okay, this is completing something that was started 5 years ago. That frankly.
But as the minister, you could sit down with Mark and say, "Listen, there's something we need to address these core issues."
We've had all these conversations. Like I've had for the last 4 months, it's been like constant discussions on this to see what's next, right? And the conclusion is let's finish this because we committed to it in the campaign.
Like campaign promises have always been broken in the past.
I know.
So why must you go through on this one?
There's look.
Just say it.
Sean, the Quebec.
You know it's wrong.
Quebec, for example, is in a very different place in Ontario, right?
We're talking about Canada. It's federal. It's not provincial.
I get it. Quebec is in a different place than other parts of Canada, right? And this is something that very much a big deal for many of the Quebec electorate that voted for us, right? And that's one of the
That's a bigger thing than it looks. First of all, it makes Gary Anandasangri look very questionable about his judgment. This is a guy who the RCMP have already flagged as a security risk. He's not allowed to deal with any files involving the Tamil Tigers as a terrorist group because he's affiliated with them. That's insane. It would be like having a Hells Angels member, the head of public safety, only in Canada. This just adds doubt to his competence. But see, the Conservatives don't understand that Anandasangri's value to the Liberals has nothing to do with his brains. It's his voting bloc. That's what they want. The Tamil Tigers is not a negative, it's a positive because they want those votes, just like they want the pro Hamas votes. Anyways, my point is that the Liberals had a bad week in terms of firearm policy because their own boss of it admitted the whole thing was fake and stupid and just done for political machinations to police certain constituencies in Quebec. That was then. But only a few days later, we have amazing news, I think. And there's actually a few things I want to talk about. I'm not a firearms expert in the same way that my dear friend Sheila Gunn Reid is, but I'm lucky today to be joined by Daniel Fritter, who is a firearms expert. He's an expert in his own right, and he's also a journalist. He writes for CalibreMag.ca, and he joins us now via Zoom. Daniel, great to see you again. Thanks for coming back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. You know, I remember a few months ago when the government was expanding the list of firearms it was going to seize. And it's got so many different variants. It's got hundreds and hundreds, but they keep coming up with obscure new variations so they can make it look like they're seizing more guns. But they tried this wrinkle. They said, we're not just doing it to make Canada safer. We're going to give these guns to Ukraine because they need the weapons. And I was thinking, you don't take a little plink, plink, plinker. You don't take an antique. You don't take a gun that you use for scaring away, I don't know, a coyote from your farm. That's not what you use when you're fighting against Russian armored personnel carriers. It was the stupidest idea I ever heard, but oh, the media loved it so perfectly. Daniel, what's the news on that? It turns out that the Liberals, they've finally come to the same conclusion. It's a stupid idea. Tell us a little more.
So apparently the Ukrainian forces basically told the Canadian government that they have very little interest in acquiring any of the firearms that would potentially be seized, which is not surprising because, like you kind of intimate, that announcement that was made way back was both laughable and offensive for two alternative reasons. Laughable because the firearms that they were considering sending to Ukraine, it was reported by, I believe, David Pugliese, if I'm getting his last name correct, that there was a specific subset of firearms that they were looking at seizing, including, and this is where things get a bit weird, SIG handguns, which are not on the list of guns in the buyback. You can still own a handgun. They haven't been banned. If you own them, you get to keep them. Colt Canada AR-15s, which are a semi-automatic version of a rifle made by the same people that make our military's rifles. But then the DND stipulated that they would only be transferring new firearms to the Ukrainian forces, and Colt Canada has not released any civilian AR-15s for some time now. And it was other guns like anti-tank missile launchers that no one who owns one of those in Canada is going to be affected by the ban, because the only people that own a Javelin missile launcher are basically the military or people who work for companies that service them for the military. So none of them would be seized. So obviously, I think what ended up happening was it seemed like a good idea from probably a more junior person unfamiliar with this stuff, floated through to DND, who said, well, we can't use any used guns because we can't guarantee their quality and whatnot. They got through to the Ukrainians and said, well, if we can get guns, we will. But then eventually it trickled down to, so we're not going to get anything. And the Ukrainians obviously announced that. It seems like the wheels are basically coming off this thing in real time, from the leaked audio from Mr. Anandasangri to this now. The former promises are just kind of unraveling. And we're seeing more and more people realize that the entire program from stem to stern is misguided at best, to use the minister's own language, potentially far more offensive than that, because like I said, that although laughable that we would ever send guns to the Ukraine from civilian gun safes where you're seizing 22 caliber rimfire rifles, it's also somewhat offensive as a gun owner to think that the government was seemingly somewhat on my behalf negotiating the expropriation of my private property to a foreign military. Is where that gets a bit okay, it stops being funny now and starts being insanely disrespectful to me, a Canadian citizen, a voter, a taxpayer, a licensed gun owner who has jumped through all the hoops to own these things, that they would be already talking with foreign officials about which specific guns I may own that they might be interested in getting for free at the expense of my tax dollars again. That's not funny. That's offensive. And I think that was one of the things that when that story came up in the media, I wished had come up more of the, this is inappropriate. Like you cannot, if this was any other sort of property, imagine them saying, we're going to seize your F-350 and send it over to a war zone. People would be getting very angry about the government negotiating that on their behalf. But because it's guns, it's somehow okay. And I hope Canadians are starting to realize that these discussions around guns don't limit to guns. If a government takes this attitude around gun owners' private property, they probably have similar attitudes around private property you may own that you might think is otherwise safe.
Yeah, your comparison to an F-350 pickup truck is right on. I mean, SUVs are always being criticized as gas guzzlers. Oh, you got to have an electric vehicle. You got to take your bike. I could imagine a future Liberal government saying, we're going to seize your old truck and give it to Ukraine to fight the war. Both sides of that are atrocious. But the idea that Ukraine is going to take, like you say, used domestic rifles and shotguns, oh, that's an idea so stupid. Only someone who has never held a firearm could say it. And I'm not passing myself off as a firearm aficionado, but this must have been come up with by some intern. But you never know. It could have come from a cabinet minister themselves. My favorite question to see is when any liberal is asked, can you define an assault weapon? I mean, just give it a go. And they usually say, well, it looks really scary. I think the look and feel of it is what they typically answer. But here's why I think this is particularly useful. It goes to the assault weapon thing. Oh, these assault weapons, assault style weapons, we got to get rid of them. Well, the people who actually do use weapons for assaults, the Ukrainian military are saying, no, those are not them. We have serious weapons of war, including, you mentioned the Javelin anti-tank missile. So in a way, it's sort of a rebuttal that these were ever assault weapons in the first place, because an actual army that actually needs them saying, no, they're not. Just stupid all the way down. But there's someone who I think understands firearms. I would bet. I mean, maybe Scott Moe of Saskatchewan knows his way around a firearm. I sort of get the feeling that he does. But other than maybe Scott Moe, I think that Alberta's Premier Daniel Smith probably has the most familiarity, just on a personal basis, with firearms of any premier, certainly more than any federal cabinet minister. Can you tell me a little bit about what Daniel Smith has been saying? Because there's a jurisdiction, there's a constitutional issue. Who gets to regulate? Who gets to enforce these laws? And as you may know, provincial affairs of a local nature fall to the provincial government, matters of a local nature. So certain things like the military, the post office, harbors, international harbors, that's the Fed's jurisdiction. But actual enforcement or seizure of firearms, that would be provincial. What's Daniel Smith saying about that?
Well, Daniel Smith has long maintained, actually, that Alberta does not have any intention in participating in this ban. That's been their position for basically the last 5 years. And she's leaning on both, like you said, the jurisdictional issues around policing and, in very real terms, budgeting, because policing is obviously paid for by provincial budgets. And as the custodian of Albertan taxpayer dollars, she made it very clear that she didn't want to see that money go towards this sort of thing. In response, the federal government years ago did offer to say, well, what we'll do is we'll transfer money to your provinces to pay for it, which in turn led her to go, no, that's not what we want. I mean, if the money was there for policing, transfer it and do something more useful with it. So instead, she created basically a licensing program where, in order to seize firearms in Alberta, the Alberta government will require that those seizure agents obtain a license to do so from the Alberta government, which they basically have no intention of issuing, which is a fun inversion of the normal situation around gun ownership, because everyone that has one legally has to have a license. So it kind of makes sense that if you want to seize it from someone with a license, you should also have a license. It's a really smart move. It also leans heavily on the administration of the Firearms Act as federal legislation falls to provincial authorities And in some cases, some provinces have hired federal staff to do so. That's a really weird division in this particular area. BC and Alberta, for example, both have provincial CFOs. They are employees of the provincial government who are in charge with administrating this entire piece of legislation within the province and working with local police and whatnot to do so. Other provinces like Ontario have a federal CFO where the actual chief firearms officer of Ontario is paid for by the federal government. So you get into this very strange jurisdictional thing where some provinces can't do what Danielle Smith is now asking to be done because the person in charge of all of this works for the federal government, sort of on behalf of the provincial people. So it's a strange situation, but it's really cool to see. And I mean, she's been so explicit as to say that they are going to throw every roadblock possible in front of this thing because she very clearly disagrees with the premise, obviously on a political level, but I think also too has made some pretty impassioned comments about this just isn't going to work. Alberta, this is not how you address crime. The people with gun licenses taking their guns away, it's a total waste of money and time. And I think that in some of the comments, I know that some people that are pro-gun control may interpret her to be somewhat dismissive, but I think that they have to look at that and think she's being dismissive of these arguments because they are worthy of being dismissed. It shouldn't, spending all of this time even debating it is a waste of time. We could be talking about homelessness, addiction issues, all of these other factors that play a much bigger role in criminality and the crime rate in Canada than whether or not some guy with a gun license likes to take his AR-15 to the range on the weekend.